My name is Ashkan Jahangiri. I'm here to give this talk. It's going to be about socialism and leftism and how that intersects with local government, the sort of things that the local chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America works on, and how a lot of that has to do with land use, with affordable housing, and really kind of trying to answer the question of, with all this sort of like theoretical understanding of what is wrong in society in a broader sense, how do we actually as people on our own challenge that and make significant change? Because it has been done, and it's kind of so hard to see how we've made progress, but we have in fact as a society made significant progress. I'm interested, and many others are interested in pushing for the next big changes. Looking back, it seems like things are awful right now and getting worse, but 100 years ago, women did not have the right to vote. Black people, brown people are still heavily oppressed in society, but we made significant advances with the civil rights movement. These sorts of things. Maybe that's a bit more grand in the scale of things I'm going to talk about today, but I think it's an interesting discussion. So, like I said, I'm Ashkan.
I'm Chad.
Chad.
Austin.
Austin.
Ben.
Ben. And then Neil. Good to see you, Neil. Okay, so first, what is DSA? DSA is the Democratic Socialists of America. It's an organization which has been around since the mid-1980s, which isn't too interesting. It's interesting today because when Bernie Sanders ran for president in 2016, he said that he was a Democratic Socialist, and Bernie Sanders, as we know, massively outperformed any sort of expectations that people had for a no-name senator from Vermont, with minimal funding and minimal media attention and these sort of things. And we think that's because Bernie Sanders demonstrated the exciting possibilities for what can be called social democratic or just progressive policies that correct the problems that we have in society today, which I'll just jump in to say, at any time really feel free to interject with anything that I'm talking about. Unless we want to get into arguments about socialism, let's do that after. But if you have clarifying questions, that sort of thing, absolutely, I will welcome those. So DSA today, because of Bernie Sanders' historic run for president and because of Donald Trump winning the presidency, that sort of woke up a lot of people, I would say, people like myself who would consider themselves to be progressive or liberal or left or whatever, but had not sort of been involved in any community organizing or organizing in any sense. And so DSA today is an organization of over 50,000 people. In Austin, we have 1,200 dues-paying members, and they get involved in different democratically decided campaigns to advance the lot of the working class and to hopefully build steps towards a mass working class political revolution. So, briefly, like, what are we talking about when we talk about socialism? We're talking about...
Real quick.
Yes.
What exactly do you mean by a political revolution? I know that this is a language that's used in traditional leftism, but it arrived in a certain historical context. Do you think that today's historical context is appropriate for using the word political revolution?
I think that remains to be seen, and we're defining it today. We certainly live in interesting times of what maybe are sort of like, moves towards neo-fascism, maybe not, with Trump. And certainly I would say that the Republican Party today is the most dangerous organized entity that has ever existed in the history of humanity, on the basis of climate denial and just driving every inhabitant of Earth towards an apocalyptic world, right? I think it's terrifying, and I think that a massive resistance needs to come to that, whether it's a revolution or whatever. And I don't think it's going to be the Democrats, frankly. I don't know if that answers your question, but I can start to go through this and maybe we'll see if that shed light on some of that. So when we're talking about socialism, it's not just an economic order, it is sort of a social order of everything in society, where I would say the three main dominant forms of oppression in society are wage slavery. Simple, like when people talk about capitalism as an economic system, you have to go to work in order to stay alive the next day, basically, for the vast majority of people. It's also about racial capitalism or just anti-racism. We understand that racism is a sort of dominant form of oppression that divides all of us, and that none of us are free until we can dismantle the conceptions of other people as anything but human, anything as an other, right? As well as patriarchal domination, which has of course been the dominant form of oppression in all of organized society, with minor exceptions here and there. But in general, rules over us every single day. And we're seeing what could be called a revolution, perhaps, in the context of the Me Too movement, I would say. It's certainly a movement that pushes back against growing up, I would say that behaviors that I was exposed to and participated in are now becoming more and more taboo and socially unacceptable, which is fantastic, which I think is very good. I think that women are half of all people, and that their subjugation in society is absolutely a top priority for relief. And so these are the sort of broad questions, to take a step back, that I would say socialists and DSA members, perhaps, I can't speak for everyone, but are interested in negating, right? These are all bad, and they hinder humanity's ability, they hinder each individual's ability to fully pursue sort of creative expression and live a nice life and these sort of things. And we can move towards steps of mitigating them and perhaps overcoming them. Talked about how Bernie and Trump helped. Simply Bernie by, I would say, putting forth policies that Democrats would refuse to discuss, but that very quickly appeal to the masses, right? Medicare for all is a big one in this country. That as you know, this is the only sort of OECD country that does not have any sort of medical healthcare provided by the government or any sort of socialized medicine as they have in England. These sort of policies, but also just solutions for people's problems today. I'm a fairly privileged person, but I don't have healthcare, and that's a certain level of precarity in society that is kind of unfathomable in the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. So who joins DSA and why? People who get woken up, I would say, by the sort of both the rhetoric and the ideas of building a better society. And so what do they actually do, and how does it work? DSA is a democratically run organization where members form different issue-based committees, and on the basis of internal discussions and seeking out opportunities for where in their local context where they might be able to make the greatest contribution, they get involved. That means both local policies, such as the affordable housing bond that just passed in Austin, but also, like I talked about, Medicare for all. For example, DSA members in cities throughout the country, including Austin, have spent thousands of hours canvassing, knocking on doors of people, just people in their cities, sort of spreading the good word of Medicare for all and talking about our broken healthcare system in America with the people of America as much as we possibly can. And these are the sort of, it's hard as an individual to say, okay, I certainly think that everyone in this country deserves healthcare, but how can I do that? And DSA attempts to provide an answer, for example. So we have Austin DSA in the last year has had some pretty successful campaigns, I would say. We were involved in getting the city of Austin to pass the first paid sick days policy in the South, where if you work for 30 hours a week, no matter in sort of what type of employment, if you work in the city of Austin, you're then to get 1 hour of paid sick time. That's 6 to 8 paid sick days a year. Consider this a sort of basic fundamental right of any working person to have, because everyone gets sick, especially in a city where so much of our workforce is in the service industry and in food service. We sort of think that this is a no-brainer. And of course, we can't raise the minimum wage in the city of Austin because of the state of Texas. So this is an impactful worker protection that we help push for.
When you said this was implemented in the South, do you mean South Austin or?
What I said, this paid sick days policy that the city of Austin passed was the first paid sick days policy of any city or state in what is referred to as
the South
US,
of the
South,
US.
the South US.
Okay.
So I think it depends on how you define the South, right? But so for example, I think the state of Arizona has a paid sick days policy, but either Washington State or Seattle has a robust paid sick days policy, but not in Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Texas. That's not. Just breezing through these. Another one is police accountability, where we were alerted, or we came became aware that police accountability measures are negotiated in contracts in exchange for wages and benefits, whereas our understanding, and I think that of many people, is that police accountability measures are not a community benefit to be negotiated for, but one that should be included no matter what, sort of. And so we were able to get the city of Austin to reject a weak contract, where we live in a city which has been consistently rated for being having the most quite deadly police force, but the worst accountability measures, such that if things do happen, simply, this is where you hear about when an officer kills someone or arrests someone, they don't get fired. And the reason is because that the rules for their accountability are negotiated in their contracts, and they tend to be very weak because police unions ask for a lot of money in exchange for things like there's a so-called 180-day rule, where if an officer manages to go 180 days after an incident without getting any sort of punishment, that's effectively a statute of limitations, and there cannot be any further, not just retribution, but any investigation of that claim. Things like this that other people who are accused of crimes, for example, do not receive the benefit of. So like if a police officer is involved in some crime, they have 48 hours to review evidence before turning it in, whereas if I am accused of a crime, I do not get that luxury. Things like that. So we were able to convince City Council to unanimously reject a police contract on the basis of insufficient accountability. I've not heard of another situation where that's happened in America. So that's very interesting. And in fact, they do not have a contract to this day. It's been almost a year, and that's still an ongoing fight. We also helped shut down Hutto, which was a women's detention center for immigrants in asylum. First, there was a famous case of a woman named Laura Monterosa who had been abused in the prison and was also a queer person who had suffered abuse on that basis as well, sort of hate crimes. And so we'd gotten her freed, and then we managed to convince the Williamson County Commissioner's Court, which is a fairly conservative body, Williamson County is just the county north of here, to shut down that detention center, which has not ended, but all asylum detention in Texas or the United States, but is a step towards immigrants' rights and immigrant justice. Another big thing we did is the $250 million affordable housing bond, and I'll talk about that more later.
Wait, it says shut down Lamar Bridge?
Oh, yeah, I chose to skip that just now, Neil, because I was involved in that, and I didn't really want to talk about myself so much. But so when Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed, there was sort of a spontaneous reaction of people who were quite, justifiably infuriated that someone who not only was going to the Supreme Court to strike down Roe versus Wade, but was also this horrible sort of like sexual abuser that people had found out about, and nonetheless was allowed to progress to the level of the Supreme Court. In frustrated protest of like, what are you going to do as just somebody who lives in America? 14 of us, not just DSA members, but some, and not as an official DSA event, but just spontaneously, DSA members and other progressive activists shut down Lamar Bridge, which crosses the Colorado River, Lamar, on the second weekend of ACL on a Saturday or something for 3 hours, just like making a big statement. I went to jail, it sucked, I got ringworm, which is bullshit, and it immediately shows you as a, again, fairly privileged person in society how inhumane, talk about systems of oppression. Jail is very scary, and we can do a lot to make people who are accused of crimes, we can humanize them, right? So for example, one campaign that Austin DSA has not at this time undertaken, but it is going on in other places, including Houston, is ending cash bail, whereby poor people who get arrested are then told that they may leave jail if they have $5,000 or whatever, but often they don't have $5,000, and then they have to stay in jail, without a trial for longer, and it's a broken, inhumane, and disgusting, shameful system in this country. Anyway, that's the Lamar Bridge.
What is problematic about that system?
The alternative that we would put forth, and that people have explored, including Travis County, to a limited extent, is a risk-based assessment of any given person accused of a crime, especially for sort of non-violent offenses that don't sort of harm other people. I don't see a reason to punish a person accused of such a crime to stay in jail just because they can't come up with an extra $1,000. If they are determined to be a risk to society, then perhaps there's a reasonable basis for that in the interim before their trial. But it's basically detention on nothing without a trial otherwise. If you simply just can't pay them, that's why you're in jail. And that works. There are studies about how that works, and we need to move towards that sort of system. So that's, like I was saying, quite a broad overview of the local Austin DSA chapter and an example of some of the campaigns we've gone into. If we're looking at where an organized group of hundreds of people might be able to direct their focus, we might look at local government, so I'll walk through that in a moment, and then talk about the affordable housing bond. But does anyone have questions here? Kind of breeze through a lot. No? Cool, we can move on. So, now this is not DSA, this is me. I'm quite interested in city government, municipal government, and changes that can be made within there. And certainly you can imagine that there's an interplay between these two things, at least possibly. So here are the four, these are the biggest things that local government does, basically. This is where local government has power and extends it. They are obviously responsible for legislation. The extent to which they can write legislation is limited by the state of Texas. So for example, the city of Austin cannot just make up new taxes. The city of Austin cannot raise the minimum wage. I already talked about a lot of things. A lot of things are in the purview of the state and then also the federal government. The city of Austin can't set a drinking age, for example. The city of Austin can do a lot of things, like pass a paid sick days policy. So legislation is a big, obvious function of local government. Another facet of local government that's significant is that simply the city of Austin has a $4 billion budget, spends that every single year in Austin. That obviously has a great impact in some sense on the city. Those impacts can be positive or they can be negative. It kind of depends on what they are. The single component of the city of Austin budget is public safety and police salaries. And so that's why police salaries are such an important issue at the local level. And it's worth reflecting on how, or at least considering how this isn't how it has to be. It just happens to be that in the American structure of government, municipal governments are given domain over public safety, and thus it comprises a significant chunk of their budget. And I think that's interesting. Yes?
What percentage of the budget is geared toward that?
That is a great question, and I forget all the numbers off the top of my head. But let's say it's not lower than 20% would be police salaries.
I remember in the city I used to live in the Dallas area, it was actually exactly 50%.
50%. So I lowball the number because I don't have it off the top of my head. But I believe I see this all the time of like it's perhaps public safety in general is maybe 40% of a budget, and then the police salaries are most of that. In any case, we can safely say that it is the biggest and a quite significant chunk between a third and a half of local budgets in any given city, right?
But so the government here only decides what amount of its budget to give to the police, but can thereafter not control how that money is used?
Well, these are terms that would be sort of written into the contract. The way it works in terms of on a year-to-year basis is that there's a 5-year contract which sets all the terms, and then in the interim, more money simply means more or fewer police. Generally not fewer, just either more money for new police officers or money for replacing police officers. And there are other sort of creative ways to go about this.
But the way that the police force uses the money, is it just up to them? Or can that be controlled by the municipal government? Like can they say, no, you can't buy guns, but you have to hire more police? Or do they make those decisions? Does the police make its own decisions? Do you know?
I don't know. But my understanding is that when the city funds the police, they're mostly funding staff, and then that comes with a commensurate amount of overhead, which would include guns and things. I see things like, for example, any given city council agenda has some item about, I don't know, a grant for body vests. So they're fractured multiple funding sources for different aspects of course, funding public safety, but that applies to everything. That applies to everything that city government might fund. Housing has, several different components of funding at different stages of development. So the budget is quite important. It's worth noting that is the budget of a medium-sized corporation, $4 billion a year. It's not too exciting, but it is all local, and thus it has a significant effect on, I would say, all our lives. Transportation and roads, again, is another example of how they spend that money. The city of Austin is also a major, kind of tied into the budget, is a major local employer. They have 13,000 employees. So any policy that the corporation that is the city of Austin dictates towards its workers, such as benefits or things like that, I would say have a strong effect on just the local employment landscape. Right, so if the city government provides paid sick days, that's a competitive benefit to being a city employee, and that, in theory, pressures other local businesses to rise to that level. The same goes for local government providing childcare services to all of their employees, which is a campaign that some people are interested in at this time. That again increases the attractiveness, I would say, and also competitiveness of the city government and puts pressure on local businesses. And then finally, where city government has most of its power and decision-making that isn't strictly financial is over land use. So the city of Austin controls zoning for the entire city, which is simply on a given lot of land, what you're allowed to build, what type of structure, how tall it can be, what the rules are, all the permitting that's required. It's a significant amount of power. And so along with that, that's the transition into the affordable housing bond. So if we're looking at where city government has a lot of power, we're looking at what's sort of on the table, we as DSA now, of what we can do. I'll now tell the story about the affordable housing bond. But before I get into the affordable housing bond specifically, does anyone have any questions now about either local government, its major functions that I characterized, or DSA or anything? No? Wonderful. So, the city of Austin had an affordable housing bond in 2006 that was about $55 million, something like that. It passed. These funds are used to provide income-restricted housing units or homeownership repair for low-income homeowners. Taking a broad step back, one of the major problems in the city of Austin, not just from a leftist perspective, but from just your average Austinite, is that of affordability and a crisis of rising rents, such that people are displaced out of this city, such that people are priced out of this city before they even get to move in. So you have situations where people get jobs in downtown Austin and cannot find a place to live, until they're in Round Rock or until they're in Buda or Kyle in extreme cases, things like that. That's not a healthy system at all. It's not financially sustainable for a local government because you have people who are using your services without properly paying into them through property taxes and so on. But also it's just a problem because rents go up every year. And that's a pain for everyone. Rents are going up and wages in general are flat. And for the third time today, I'll highlight that the city does not have the power to raise the minimum wage, which is kind of interesting and unfortunate, I would say. But in a situation where we can't raise wages, and then a situation in which, let's say, rent or mortgage, but most people are renters in the city of Austin, is like, let's say, it's the number of housing units divided by the number of jobs, basically, and then times some constant, that's everything else. But these are two of the significant components. Wait, it's backwards.
No.
You know what it's for? Yes, that's correct.
No.
That's backwards. It is backwards. Because if
Yeah,
you have more
housing
jobs,
has
you
to be in
get.
the denominator, right?
Yeah, if you get more jobs without adding new housing, then rents go up. And that's exactly the story of Austin for the last 30 years. It's backwards again?
Rents.
Sorry?
You wrote rents instead of housing.
Thanks. So Austin, since the late 80s, has been a booming tech city. The University of Texas is a major local employer and has attracted a lot of the knowledge industry. So you have IBM coming in the late 80s, all the way up until today, where until fairly recently it was possible that Amazon would come and supposedly bring 50,000 jobs. These economic development things are all good for the city. They do bring us new revenue and make us a more attractive, vibrant city. But when we do not add sufficient housing, and we have not added sufficient housing, then we have rents rising. And when that happens, it prices people.
When you say that we have not added sufficient housing, you're not saying that the city is responsible for adding housing. That's a private matter, right? Like here's construction going on all around Austin. So are the rent prices high simply because the construction hasn't caught up yet?
Our zoning, thank you. Our land use, our zoning laws restrict construction and guide construction such that the city has significantly contributed without playing a direct role in development to the housing crisis. So for example, take redevelopment of single-family homes. It is the case that 70% of demolitions in the city of single-family homes become larger, simply are redeveloped into larger single-family homes. Larger single-family homes are, in fact, less affordable than the structure that was there before. And the reason that these homes are being converted into larger mansions is because the zoning laws that the city of Austin has set in place that mandate things like occupancy limits and if you're allowed to build, for example, what's called a fourplex, which is simply a big home. Everyone's familiar with a duplex, but a fourplex is 4 homes that it can even look like a house on the outside, right? Because these things are illegal to build, we've sort of helped mandate on affordability, or at least we drive the decisions of all the developers and homeowners and all this and all the involved people in a direction that is not conducive to an affordable unit at the end of the day.
What were the concerns which led such mandates to exist in the first place? They didn't come out of nowhere.
They didn't come out of nowhere. So in 1928, the city of Austin produced a master plan that essentially said, this is the main street of Austin, this is the main public square, this is where these people will live, this is downtown, this is the Capitol, and this was East Avenue, which is now I-35, and they said here is where people of color will live. And it was a public-private partnership in the sense that that's official city policy, but also banks would not provide loans, utility companies would not provide services to any black or brown people who tried to live elsewhere in the city. And that's the basis of Austin's land use code, was this master plan. In 1985, a new land use and development code was enacted that in the interim, the Fair Housing Act had passed, which the Fair Housing Act, which simply says you can't segregate housing, went to the ballot in Austin and lost such that the city of Austin rejected desegregation in housing.
When was that?
Well, after the Civil Rights Act of 68.
Interesting.
Yeah, 1968. So our land use code is rooted in racism from 1928, and then in 1985 there was a sort of like.
Can I ask some more questions? Just like curious.
Please.
How do you? So this ballot that you said lost. This was a ballot that was advocating for desegregation, right? How do you write it down in a form of law? Like how do you define what is desegregation?
So like for example, our landlords are allowed to restrict who they rent to on the basis of race.
Okay.
Yes, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Our mortgage lender is allowed to discriminate on the basis of race.
Okay, so this is like the fair. Okay.
It's the Fair Housing.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you're not allowed to discriminate who you rent out to based on.
Right, that's a
Okay,
federal
okay.
policy since the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah. I get that.
As far as what it meant for Austin voters to reject it, I don't know. I
Mm.
do know that Austin today is consistently on top of list of the most economically and just racially segregated cities in America. That continues to be the case. It stems from 1928 where historic freedom towns in Austin that were in West Austin, such as Clarksville, were shut off, or the access to them was shut off to people of color, and people of color were, only allowed to live in the East Side. And that's why, like today, that explains the sort of divide today of Austin and perceptions of the East Side. So for example, I recall that when I moved here to Austin to attend UT, all I was told was that, okay, West Side is fine, East Side is dangerous. So I didn't know that meant that, okay, the East Side is dark, and that's all that meant. But it's interesting. And then, okay, so 1928, in 1985, we passed a new land use code that formalizes a lot of the segregation without being so overt, right? So for example, restrictions on really restricting development on existing communities of majority white single-family homeowners such that no one else can move in. Things like this. And today the major mechanism is pricing. And so when development as a whole in the city is suppressed, the mechanism of pricing becomes quite clear as the determinant of who gets to live where. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm still trying to connect it to the thing that I asked the question about. I've heard about this before, that, you know, for example, in some parts of the city, you cannot demolish a single-family house and build an apartment where you could be renting out to 5 different apartments. And so you're saying these rules kind of stem from a rewriting of what used to be more explicitly racial laws. So in the, for example, the more white parts of town, now the land use code says that, oh, you cannot convert a single-family dwelling into a multi. Okay.
Yes. In most of the area that is zoned residential in this city, where you're allowed to build any sort of housing, apartments are illegal to build. You cannot get a permit for them, you cannot build them. There is no functional reason for this other than some sort of, there are concerns over what's called neighborhood character. We like our neighborhood the way it is with its wide setbacks, which is how far any structure can be on a given lot, with its parking requirements and things like this. These sort of things, I'm saying that pricing is the function now of pricing people out because it isn't explicitly race-based, that's illegal and we can't do it, but we can do it by pricing and we are doing it by pricing. And it's complicated and it shows up in myriad different ways such that it's hard to like comprehensively tackle without just saying, oh, the land use code is messed up.
Yeah.
Let me give you one example of how we mandate unaffordability. But a simple one is height restrictions. If you're allowed to build fewer units on a given lot, and you're trying to eke out a profit or you're trying to make a significant profit, whoever you are, a private developer, an affordable housing developer, whatever, then if you can build more units on a given spot of land, you can serve more units with the same basic infrastructure as a city, that's a more affordable overall property. Quite obviously, if you can build a fourplex somewhere, whereas before you were only allowed to build one housing unit, maybe it's not a quarter as cheap, but maybe it's, you know, a third as cheap, or yeah, you know, it's cheaper, certainly. And this is how, so another example that I was going to talk about is parking requirements. So parking requirements, it's been thoroughly characterized in the literature, or have been arbitrarily determined in American cities, and that there's no reasonable basis for a city to mandate that any given development should have parking. In general here, the consensus is that, as much as I hate to say it as a socialist, that the so-called the market will provide. That is, if you're building an office building, you're not gonna not build any parking if the city doesn't make you. You'll build what you think is enough parking. But that the story of American cities and parking is that we've overbuilt parking. Okay, why is parking so important? A bunch of reasons, but from the perspective of affordability alone, if you build an apartment complex that is required to have 2 parking spaces per unit, and your land is this big, this used to be East Austin, now this is just one lot, then maybe you can only build like 5, you know, units, and the rest is just parking. The average parking spot is 330 square feet. accounting for the other part of the parking lot that goes with any given spot. So if 330 square feet, if you live in a studio apartment that's required to have one spot, you're almost doubling the amount of land you have to dedicate to that one apartment without giving the person who lives in that apartment like more space. They may not need a car, they may not want a car. In fact, transportation is the second highest household expense after housing. So, and that's because driving a car can cost thousands of dollars a year. Whereas riding public transportation, if it's widely available, costs $500 a year. Like riding a bike all these things are much cheaper. So we mandate unaffordability when we force people to overbuild parking, which is what we have done throughout this city. I invite you to take a look when you drive up and down Lamar, the South Congress, or Guadalupe. There are always just vacant parking lots everywhere, and they're very poor land use, and they're sort of a slap in the face to people who want to see a vibrant, walkable city that is welcoming to people and that is accessible to all people, regardless of their mobility impairments or things like that. It's bad land use, and it makes housing more expensive. Were you going to ask something? No? Okay. So parking is one example of how the land use code trickles down into making housing more expensive. It can increase the cost of a unit by up to $15,000 if you have to build a parking garage.
So previously I used to live in the East Riverside area, which was historically the colored part of Austin. And there's a whole bunch of student apartments there now, pretty cheap. And I used to live in one of them, and there's way more apartment complexes being built there every day. So I'm wondering, are the housing and land use rules more lax there, that you can just build this apartment? Like,
there are
they just like
times.
less restricted than downtown or North Campus?
Well, downtown is generally unrestricted,
Okay.
except for a small part of downtown called Judges Hill. Everything is zoned not quite to the sky, but almost to the sky. Actually, it's more restricted than it should be, certainly. There isn't a reasonable argument for anything like height restrictions, for example. These things, they make the city worse. I've talked about how affordability suffers, but for example, our downtown and our city is less shaded because we prevent the construction of taller buildings, which I walk around a lot in the city, and I walk around a lot in the summer, and I'm always quite sweaty. And it isn't really the case that it has to be this way. Sacramento is a reasonably comparable city, and it has an urban canopy that is trees cover something like 90% of its urban area. It can be 90 degrees and much cooler and walkable in Sacramento in the summer. So we do this to ourselves in a bunch of different ways.
But what are the geographical regions in Austin that have these relatively stricter land use codes?
So West Austin, especially as relating to what's called Save Our Springs, that is attempt to save, the Edwards Aquifer, not save, but prevent overdevelopment from ruining the water quality of the city. I mean, there's a reasonable basis for that, but what it in effect did is restrict development in West Austin. Meanwhile, in Central Austin, many Central Austin wealthy neighborhoods so effectively suppressed their development that they actually lost population between 2000 and 2010, which is kind of incredible to think about, because what's the story of Austin? The story of Austin is that the population doubles every 20 years. So at the same time as the population is growing at this massive rate, to where we went from a sleepy town of 500,000 people several decades ago to now 1 million. The metro region has 2 million people. There are neighborhoods 2 miles outside of downtown that lost population, and it's because they restricted housing development in myriad different ways. I think that's a shame. Those are so Central and West Austin, just kind of broad brushstroke. I would say are the places where development is more restricted. What's called the Eastern Crescent, which simply means that it's the east side and kind of sprinkling up north of 183, but still somewhat west of 35, and then maybe the East Riverside area and south of that, perhaps. I guess so. These areas are zoned for higher entitlements today. There was an effort to comprehensively update the land use and development code. I didn't intend to talk about this, and now we're just riffing, which is fun. But that was called Code Next, and that took far too long. and it sort of got shot down. But with the recent elections, there is now hope that we can come in and undo what I think is a segregationist land use code. Because today, 110 people move to the greater Austin region every day. It's like the 5 or 6 county region of Austin. And an increasingly smaller share of those people are allowed to live within the city. So at this point, it's something like, if we keep our land use code today, over the next 10 years, only 27% of the population growth, of the regional population growth, will in fact be to the city center. That's not at all reflective of any sort of measurable attitudes or public opinion of where people would want to live. The best available data of where any average person might want to live is the Houston Kinder Area Survey, or the Kinder Houston Area Survey, which is a multi-decade survey that asks questions that get at, would you rather live closer to the downtown of your city, even if it meant you had to live in an apartment and not have a car, versus living a more suburban lifestyle. That preference is consistently about 50-50, and it tilts towards the urbanized lifestyle. However, that's not what we offer people today, and if you want to call it today's housing market. The majority of housing units are single-family homes, at least the majority of properties zoned for single-family homes. I don't actually know about the majority of units. And apartments, again, are illegal in most of the areas of the city. So we are not allowing people to express to even buy what they want. Even if you do want to live in an apartment, those are not available to you at the rate at which people want them. So Code Next was an attempt to update the land use code. It got shut down. It is now in limbo. It will come back. We can't stop. I mean, we can't keep today's land use code. We can't keep things like a ban on apartments in most of the city. We can't keep things like a restriction of housing units because, somebody wants to be. You've heard the term NIMBY? Has anyone heard the term NIMBY? I just want to make a joke, which NIMBY often stands for not in my backyard, of people who, give out every reason for why they don't want this affordable housing complex to go near them or something like that. But height restrictions are a particularly cruel one, because the best justification that's offered for them are that people who live on the top floors of a given housing unit next to a single-family home will peer into the backyard, and these people want to be naked in their backyards and don't want black people to look at them. I'm being a little bit facetious.
So I live in Hyde Park, just north of campus, and so as I'm sitting here listening to your talk, the realization is dawning on me that it's one of the more regulated land use code areas of Austin.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are single family dwellings. They're set back pretty far. All of them have parking lots, and I don't think you're allowed to build any apartments in that whole neighborhood. And I've seen a lot of signs on the street. And so when you said Code Next, the only thing that I remember was a phrase: Code Next destroys neighborhoods.
Yes.
I was like, where did I see that? Well, it's everywhere in Hyde Park.
I've been a little bit too callous in my characterization of opponents to housing construction, but that stems from the idea that you do modernize the land use code. You try to dismantle the racism that is in there, and the argument that slogan makes is that by doing so, immediately every single family home on the basis of profit will be turned over into an apartment complex without any agency from people who currently live there. I don't think that would happen. That would not happen. Hyde Park, Hyde Park actually effectively has a zoning overlay which supersedes anything that, if it's called an NCCD, a neighborhood combining something district, it effectively suppresses all development. So you have a situation in which Hyde Park is actually twice as dense as the city proper. There are some apartment complexes up through Hall, for example. But you are not allowed to change Hyde Park at
just
all.
North of campus.
Right. You're not allowed to change Hyde Park. That's absolutely correct. It is in stasis, and that was the intention in the late '90s when the NCCD was created, was to stop growth in Hyde Park. We're talking about stopping people from living north of a 50,000 student university, right? 2 miles north of downtown, these sort of things. I think this is awful. I think my basic, one basic line is that anybody should be able to live in any neighborhood. I think anybody, of course, should be able to live in Austin. We have a situation today in which many people are prevented from living in Austin because they're priced out, either at the onset or gradually as they are Austin residents who are pushed out into not necessarily even suburbs, just sort of lower pockets of the city who are forced to cram in apartments, for example, at a higher rate than they might want. Yeah.
I don't know if that probably goes soon, but I was wondering before I go, if you could you maybe comment a little bit on Proposition J, like the background to it, if you know the background of it, and
So I signed the petition that put Proposition J on the ballot. This is because a lot has happened since November when I signed that. But at the time, I was on campus, and a petitioner who I've seen or saw as recently as the last election we had this week approached me and said that and asked me if I supported affordability and if I supported democracy. I mean, sure, I support those things.
What about apple pie?
Sorry? What about apple pie? Exactly. And I was just, I was at some protest on campus about climate change and like Wells Fargo, so I said, sure, I'll sign your petition. Later I find out what the petition is, which is to send code next to the ballot. Sending code next to the ballot was an attempt to circumvent the city council that was perceived to be on its way to passing code next. So Prop J was kind of a moot point by the time that November came around. I actually testified to city council when they were putting Prop J on the ballot, as they were legally required to say that I was duped into signing this petition. There was no recourse for me as someone who signed it to be able to say, hey, actually I don't support this, and they think that this was, my signature was duplicitously garnered, these sort of things. I'm happy that Prop J failed. I'm not surprised. I am surprised that Prop J failed. I had no idea what to expect, but when you see something on the ballot and you see democracy or whatever, should people be allowed to vote? Probably the inclination is yes. The truth is, I don't see any reason why people should be allowed to vote, or on what is essentially a very technical document that highlights, building codes and all these other sort of minutia. It doesn't make sense to me. Very few people have read the land use code or code next, other than people who are directly involved. However, we are able to know its effects and how we can change those. It's not a requirement to have a 1,200 or 1,400 page land use code. The city of Miami has a 200 page land use code, quite famously. It's relatively simple as it can be. And 30 pages of its code are dedicated to hurricanes. So a major city, Miami, smaller than Austin but comparable, gets by just fine with a simpler code. This complex code with what are effectively burdensome regulations, they mandate unaffordability. I haven't even talked about it because I haven't had much of an opportunity and it's getting late. But there's a huge environmental question here as well. To the extent that we suppress any sort of housing in the city of Austin and development in the city of Austin, we push it out to the hill country. We build over the hill country. We build over floodplains. We pave over trees and all this sort of thing. We increase how much people have to drive. We increase trip lengths and regional vehicle miles traveled, which is a measure of greenhouse gas emissions. Even if you have an electric car, the carbon that it takes to build a car is about equivalent to the tailpipe emissions of a gas-burning car, and so on and so on. The city's current master plan, Imagine Austin, calls for a compact and connected city that would certainly get at a lot of these questions of affordability, but also environmental sustainability, and so on. So I think they're all very important. DSA has nothing to do with Code Next or any of this. These are all just kind of my personal opinions. And we've really drifted in a nice way. Yes, no?
Well, I mean, you're not getting terribly late, but if people have to leave, you want, in your little blurb for the talk, you mentioned a little bit about what is the proper role for people concerned, but people not necessarily involved in a party like yours, but general citizens who are concerned with stuff like this. What is the proper course of action or roles, if you could say a few words about that?
Thank you. First, I would like to clarify that DSA is not a political party. It's a it's a certainly politically oriented organization, but technically it's just a nonprofit, 501c4. There are many other nonprofits and other sort of like local community groups that we work with that have a similar classification. I think the answer is first, these problems have to be understood and people have to be aware of them. It's easy for me as an average person, as a person in Austin to know that the city is unaffordable, that it's hard to find housing. I moved every 6 months to 1 year when I lived here, and it was because rents go up. Like that's a sort of obvious truth. But I did not know why, and thus I wasn't in a position to understand how to address that. So becoming aware of these problems, of the major problems, becoming aware of who has the power to address these problems, right? That's a significant component. You direct your energies toward your congressional representatives, towards the federal government. That would be the next step. So identifying problems, identifying who has the ability to rectify them, not necessarily who is responsible, right? It may be some other entity that's able to bring about positive change. And then finally, if it's not DSA, then there are sort of two ways to do things, to get things done. And one is by throwing money at a problem, and the other is by organizing the power of people and so on. And so for me, for a lot of people, the answer is then for someone who is concerned with these questions, whatever they might be, to join an organization, to get involved, even if it's a group of friends, and to target the people who can solve the problems that you're interested in solving. And I think that there are many areas of opportunity for that, from the basis of affordability or environment or any of the major questions we have today. Yeah.
So just, having lived in this country for some time, one of the benefits of, watching the political process and things is you can sometimes develop kind of muscle memory. So when somebody comes up to you with like one of those clipboards and like they want you to sign, you can like sniff out that there's something smelly here.
Yeah.
Those people did that same thing to me outside the library in downtown, and I have some nice ways of really pissing them off. So
Much like,
Would
in fact, from
you
the-
ask like hard questions or?
No, I just totally ignored. Like, I mean, it was kind of brutal. I don't usually do it, but in this case, I knew who these people were.
Yeah.
And like, I didn't know them like beforehand, but
Yeah.
you can kind of tell quickly. And they've been playing this game for decades, Like there was this in '94, Newt Gingrich's contract with America. I mean, their language is very critical,
Yeah, I mean, there are people who, so I said money is a way to address problems, whereas I don't have money and I'm not going to address these social problems with money. I'm going to do it by organizing it with people, and that's more meaningful. What you're seeing there is money. The people that you're referring to that you can see and that I can see, they're just the canvassers, right? They're just paid, they don't care, they get a decent wage for collecting those signatures, but good for them, I don't care. They're there because someone has a problem with local government and they're going to pursue it by putting an initiative on the ballot, a referendum, calling for a referendum on whatever it might be. There's one going around right now about putting this soccer stadium up on the ballot because there are invested parties who are they're fundamentally anti-government, right? And they're trying to agitate in a destructive way and destroy trust in public institutions, shaky as it is. And so what you're seeing there is money. That's money. They are bringing about change by pursuing ballot initiatives because all you need is a certain number of signatures, and you can get that if you pay people to stand outside the Austin Public Library long enough. Well, thank you very much. This went in a fun direction. Hope you learned a little bit about both DSA and the functions and possibilities of and for local government. Thanks.
So one more question, just curious, what are your thoughts or impressions about the recent election and results? Or like especially people who are very, I know a lot of people who are extremely, interested in it, and I'm just curious, what is the...
Do you mean at a particular level?
State, more
federal?
so, state and national.
So national, what, the House flipped, right? The House flipped, okay, the House flipped. I think that, if I was, Nancy Pelosi, your Speaker of the House, I would immediately, I would be just throwing shit at Republicans and throwing mud in their gears, you know, and just being loud and boisterous and powerful and saying, okay, we have the small bit of control here and we're going to exercise it to the extent that we can to stop you from your horrific agenda, right? My God, this tax cut that passed was awful. It was a huge step back for society last year. The Senate flipped, even though 9 million more people voted for Democrat, or not flipped, but the Republican stronghold in the Senate was greatly strengthened. Great. I think the Senate is a fundamentally anti-democratic institution that is the only, Senates are the only institutions in the United States that are allowed to violate one person, one vote, right?
How's that?
How's that city of, or how many people
Oh,
in Wyoming,
okay,
you know?
okay.
The representation
Yeah,
that you
yeah,
get
yeah.
as a rural or whatever.
Right,
you say,
right.
doesn't compare to like the people. I mean, what right does I think someone in Nebraska is worth 27 times more than someone in California? No, people are people. So it's upsetting that after this election the Senate still exists, and it's even further upsetting that it is in the hands of the Republican Party. But what would have happened if the Democrats took it? I can't tell you. I think the Democrats have failed to demonstrate how they can meaningfully provide for people. That's why I ended up, that's part of what led me here. The Democrats had control of the House and the full branches of government for 2 years, from 2008 to 2010. We nationalized General Motors, and instead of using that to really provide for American cities by building, I didn't even get to public transportation, by building light rail for cities throughout America. We could have done all that, and we could have done that as the local government controlling GM. We instead, we of course bailed out the Wall Street, and we bailed out mortgage lenders for some reason. We gave GM back to private hands and this sort of thing. On healthcare, Medicare for all. If there was a strong public push for Medicare for all for that time, I would have hoped it passed. But why did we elect all these Democrats anyway? We didn't even get a public option. Obama didn't even really push it. There are all these articles about how, like, in meetings with Joe Lieberman or whatever, he was like, "Yeah, Obama told me it wasn't a big deal to have a public option." So, like, yeah, I guess I wish that Republicans lost, but it's not as if I wish that more Democrats won. I guess I do, just on the basis of how awful Republicans are. But it's not because they offer any great hope. That's my general perspective of the federal level. At the state level, we did not flip the Texas State House as some people thought we might. The Republicans still have majority control. Perhaps the Tea Party was tempered a bit. At the state level, I think the big question is who becomes Speaker of the House. We'll see how that goes. And that'll be an eventful 6 months coming up. Texas State Legislature meets for 140 days or 80 days out of every 2 years, unless the governor calls a special session. That's kind of insane. It happens to be okay because the Texas State Legislature is bad, so the less time they get to do stuff, the less shit they can fuck up, right? But it's a miserable system. At the local level, I think on progressive land use we made some gains. Proposition J failed. This doesn't directly tie in with land use, but there was a ballot item for an independent audit of the city. That was some sort of like right-wing scheme, like ALEC and the Koch brothers sort of thing, of like, oh, you should privatize Austin Energy and Austin Water. It is so great, or not, I don't know about Austin Water. It's wonderful that we have a municipal energy provider. It's fantastic, both from sustainability and from just service, forget about even prices. I'm from Dallas, where they're like, I just remember it always being a pain in the ass to like get an energy provider in Dallas, and that they were like getting in contact with them and they charge you too much and all these sort of things. So I'm glad that audit failed at the local level. What else? As far as city council, mostly we have a weekly progressive city council. Our city council members have been more conservative on land use. And we're moving away from that. And I'm excited for the possibilities there. There's still some runoffs, so we'll see.
Your question about revolution reminded me of, I was talking to somebody this morning who's a Dutch citizen, and I said, like, do you remember what happened 100 years ago in Netherlands? Obviously not. But kind of a revolution occurred. What was it called? The Kaiser of Germany. He abdicated and he moved to Netherlands. So, well, that might be way of thinking about revolution.
But I mean,
Yeah.
I grew up in a communist state in West Bengal, so although there weren't bloody revolutions happening as I was growing up, I mean, they were unfolding in the streets when my dad was a kid or in college, for example. So I know where the terminology comes from in the leftist and socialist groups. And I've been to the International Socialist Association's meetings on campus, and they still talk very fervently about bloody revolution. I'm like, wait, hang on a moment. Is that like, are you guys for real? Like, I'm with you as far as your intentions are concerned, but this is some fantastic fairy story that you're going to go around in the streets and kill people? Like, what do you mean by? So that's why I was asking, when you say, when people in the DSA talk about revolution, you're not talking about from outside the system, you're talking about reform from within.
No, I don't know if I would necessarily buy that framing, but certainly I would say, I'll just clarify, no one's calling, or I'm certainly not calling for violent revolution. DSA is not calling for any sort of like violent uprising or any sort of militancy in that sense. I mean, what is DSA pushing for today? They're pushing for things that are often characterized as like New Deal democratic policies. Why is that? Is it because we're a bunch of well-meaning liberals? No, I think it's because these are the obvious corrections we can make in today's society, and then we'll see from there. We can push for structural, transformative changes. Like, I think Medicare for All isn't just for, like, for example, Medicare for All is not a, I would not characterize it as a small reform from within. It would fall under what Andre Gores called non-reformist reforms, where I think if you take a sixth of the GDP out of the private market and into the public domain, that has a transformative effect on society. One such effect is that workers are no longer tied to their employers. The vast majority of health insurance that's administered in this country is done so through employers. And so that poses a problem when you have issues with your employer because your health insurance might be tied into it, or your spouse's health insurance might be tied into it, your children's, or whatever. So I think that pushing for these sort of transformative changes, improving people's lives today, and the way that we can identify is the way forward. And then once we do those things, we'll rinse and repeat. And that we can push for massively more progressive. And one thing that I haven't talked about, and shame on me, is the fact that the wealth of the United States is based on primitive accumulation of and exploitation of the people and resources of the global South. And that without addressing this problem, we are incapable of moving forward. So it's not universal to have Medicare for all in America, right? Like, everybody deserves access, or not access, everybody deserves high quality healthcare as a basic human right, or just something you need to live. And so there are the domestic reforms that are on the table. What needs to also come is a stronger anti-imperialist movement, explicitly anti-imperialist movement. No blood for oil. I mean, sanctions are like horrible crimes. I think they're crimes of aggression, right? Like, I'm Iranian, and Persian people, and Iranian people are suffering and have been for quite a long time. First under their theocratic revolution, followed by Iran-Iraq war, heavily funded on both sides by the United States, which my mom grew up getting bombed on the way to school and stuff like that. I can't imagine, right? So I'm certainly not calling for that sort of thing. It's talking about violent revolution. There's so much that's messed up in society, but then there are a lot of places where we can see like, oh, wouldn't it be better if we just didn't do this bad thing? So let's not do all these bad things, and then reassess, see where we are. Then were people still going to be calling for a violent revolution? I don't know, we'll see.
Well, the thing is, most revolutions probably are not violent. I mean, this was not violent at all. I mean, but there was some threat. His own soldiers, he was afraid of his own soldiers. They would kill him like they killed the Russians. But yeah, I mean, so many of them. And most of them, as Kennedy said, was if you make the possibility of peaceful change impossible, then, that's when these things occur. So if there's, pressure cooker and there's no outlet, then.
Yeah. So,
All right.
thank you so much.
Cool.